I'm Dr. John Plake, Chief Innovation Officer at the American Bible Society and Editor-in-Chief of the annual State of the Bible Research Study. Since 2011, we've been exploring America's relationship with the Bible, faith, and the church, and we've been learning more about the positive impact of Bible engagement on the lives of our friends, our neighbors, and our coworkers. You can learn more about the state of the Bible in America by visiting stateofthebible.org. My guest today is Dr. Ryan Burge. He's Associate Professor of Political Science at Eastern Illinois University in Charleston, Illinois, where he focuses on the intersection between religiosity and political behavior, especially in the American context. And he's the author of numerous peer-reviewed journal articles and 4 books, some of them you might know, one of them, The Nones, then The Great Dechurching, and 20 Myths About Religion and Politics in America. You can follow Dr. Burge on X at Ryan Burge, or you can subscribe to his excellent Substack, highly recommend it, called Graphs About Religion, and you can find that at graphsaboutreligion.com. Ryan, welcome. Thanks for joining me today.
Well, thanks for that wonderful introduction. I appreciate that.
I'm happy to do it. You've written extensively about Americans who claim no religious affiliation. My wife always gets on me about this because she thinks when I'm talking about the Nones, I'm talking about some Catholic sisters, but it's not spelled like that. It's the N-O-N-E-S. People who say when they're asked what their religious affiliation is, they have none. And you've also looked at the issue of religious churn through the lens of the Cooperative Election Study. Read that on your Substack just this week. And so I'd like to take a few minutes to dig in and explore these important topics, because the nones in America really are our neighbors, our coworkers, and our friends, like I was talking about earlier. And for those of us who are deeply and meaningfully engaged with the Bible, we really want to know how to connect an authentic faith to those who are on a journey of their own, but maybe at a different place. So let's begin with the demographics of the nones. Our State of the Bible research suggests that about 1/4 of American adults have no religious affiliation. We've noticed that they're disproportionately part of the millennial generation or Gen Z. They're also somewhat more likely to be single than married, more likely to be men than women. And so those results just kind of make me wonder, is being a none part of a developmental stage? Like, are they on their journey from something to something else? I'm curious what you've observed.
The one thing that's really sort of surprising is how unstable religious identification is at the individual level. You know, like I'm a Baptist. I've been a Baptist since the day I was born. I grew up in a Baptist church, baptized Baptist church, Baptist pastor now. So if you ask me at 10, 20, 30, 40, what I was on a survey, I would say I'm Baptist. What I've realized is that not everyone is like me who takes surveys, right? The general public is a lot different. And just to highlight that cooperative election study thing I wrote last week, they did a survey in 2020 of about 61,000 people. They recontacted about 11,000 of them 2 years later, so just 24 months later, and like 15% of them gave a different answer to the religious affiliation question in that second wave versus the first wave. So there's a ton of churn, and that's just a 2-year window. Imagine if you made it 4, 6, 10-year window, how many people would answer that question differently at time 2, time 3, time 4 compared to that first time. So for a lot of people, they don't hold their religious identity closely or strongly. It's very malleable. It seems like it's very suggestible. It seems like, and I think that tells you that there's a significant number of people who we call, they're in a liminal space, right? Which is like on the way from one thing to another thing. And I think for some of the nones, I think the atheists are not in the liminal space. Like, you don't call yourself an atheist if you're just like half, like one dip toe in the water of atheism. Like you are either all the way in or all the way out. But like, for instance, there's a category called nothing in particular among the nones, and that's a very malleable space. Man, I call it like the transfer station of American religion. Seems like a lot of people are going from like religion to non-religion, like go through the nothing in particular passageway, and then people going the other direction, going from, being an atheist or agnostic to being religious. You hardly ever see people go from the far end of religion to the other far end of religion. So like evangelical to atheist or atheist to evangelical, you almost always go through those liminal spaces between those two identities. And I think that's what we need to understand better about people. One of my life goals is to do a really good panel survey on religion, a huge one of 30, 40, 50,000 people, and track them over 30 years, every stage of the life course, to see just how liminal and how squishy people are when it comes to religion in terms of how they answer the affiliation question, the belief question, the behavior question. Those are things we don't really know right now because there's no one who's really taken on that's a hefty project. I'm not going to lie, but man, we could learn a lot about America just by doing a project like that.
So you raised an interesting point that atheists, agnostics, and nuns, they sometimes get lumped together into an AAN cluster, atheist, agnostic, and none. We've done that even in State of the Bible. And it sounds like that's probably a mistake because to be an atheist is to be committed to a set of beliefs about the non-existence of God, whereas to be nothing in particular is really that space in between, maybe on a journey to something else or nothing else in particular.
Yeah, I think we talk about, so we're working on new ways to classify the nuns right now because the old system is really rudimentary and it came out like 20 years ago when the nuns were 12-14% of the population. Now they're 25 or 30%. So you got to create better schema to understand this. The way we understand it right now is they're secular people. That's atheists and agnostics. So they've thrown off a religious worldview. I mean, they never had a religious worldview, but they've replaced it with a secular worldview based on empiricism and science and rationality and logic and all those things, right? The nothing in particular is we call them non-religious because they don't have a religious worldview, but they also haven't adopted a secular worldview either. So they're sort of like floating in philosophical, theological, ideological space. They don't have any sort of structure around them. And just to plug a project that I'm working on right now, I got a Templeton grant to do the largest ever survey of non-religious Americans. We did 12,000 of them. And we created sort of 4 clusters of nuns. And the way that we look at it right now, one is called nuns in name only. Like they literally look like religious people on every metric, except they say they're nothing in particular atheist or agnostic. And you're like, what is wrong with you? Like you are a religious person. You just don't want to say it. Then there's the SBNRs, spiritual but not religious. And that's obviously an interesting category because they score really low on traditional religion measures, but reasonably high on spiritual matters. Things like they do astrology or yoga or walks in the woods or things like that. And then the last 2 categories are really interesting. One, I call them militant nuns or evangelical nuns. That's to use a word because they're nuns. They really don't like religion and they think you should leave religion too. Like we actually asked them, have you ever tried to convince someone to leave religion in the last 12 months? And they like 25% of them said yes, which is a lot in this world. And then there's like a libertarian nun who's just like, I don't like religion at all. I think it's awful. But if you're religious, I don't really care. So like we're really trying to dig underneath the surface and try to take those old categories away and replace them with more meaningful categories to help people see the differentiations inside the nuns that are not just based on labels, but based on behavior and belief and belonging and action and orientation towards religion. Are you antagonistic towards it? Do you feel positive towards it? This is what's exciting about social science. We're just on the front edge of this next wave of research about non-religious Americans.
That's fascinating. I can't wait for that segmentation to come out. I want to kind of circle back to this idea of religious churn. So last year in our State of the Bible survey, we asked our respondents about their own faith and about the faith of their mother when they were 10 years old. Most people, even if they come from a one-parent home, are with their mother in America. And so 22% of the nuns in our poll said they were raised with no religious affiliation. So they were somewhat consistent with their childhood. 78%, though, had come from another faith. And I thought these were really interesting. 32% said they were raised Catholic, but now they had no particular religious affiliation. 18% were raised Protestant and had become unaffiliated, and 22% were raised Christian, but they didn't identify as either Catholic or Protestant. Maybe they just didn't know exactly what it was. So how do those results compare with the findings that you have from other research studies?
So the General Social Survey has been asking folks in what religion were they raised and in their current religion. And they've been doing that for 30 years now, which is awesome because you can like track how this has changed. Right. The survey you guys did is a great snapshot of today, but like what did it look like 20, 30 years ago? What you're seeing is that every single birth cohort is more likely to be raised in a non-religious household compared to the previous birth cohort. So if you look at people born in the 1950s, about 3% of them said they were born in a non-religious household. And obviously, this is recollection, by the way, which is obviously problematic for a whole bunch of reasons that we don't want to get down that methodological rabbit hole of like, how do we look back at our past and recreate it in a meaningful way? But what's happened though, it's gone from 3% raised in a non-religious household to about 15% of young people are now raised in a non-religious household. But what's interesting about that though is only half of the nuns, even amongst youngest Americans, like 18 to 25, only half of them who are nuns today were raised nuns, which means that half of them were raised religious and became nuns at some point early in their life, between probably 15 and 25 years old. About half of people who leave religion do it in that window between 15 and 25 years old. 25% say they leave before that, before 15. 50% leave between 15 and 25 years old. So 75% of people, if they're going to leave religion, do it by their 25th birthday. If they get through that stage of life, they're pretty much locked in, which makes sense though, right? Because that's like a very volatile period of your life. You're moving, you don't have a lot of agency because your parents take you everywhere. You're figuring out who you are. You're getting, you're going to college, all those things. All those changes, have ramifications, and religion is downstream of all those changes. So I think it's really important for us to know that there's very few adult deconversions from religion. It almost always happens in teenage years and young adult years. And from that point forward, it really sort of stabilizes for the rest of your life.
And that's fascinating. I think it has tremendous implications for how Christians do ministry and choose to serve different age groups in their communities, among their neighbors and their friends. But I want to turn our attention to the fact that you're a political scientist, and we're in a rather tumultuous election year in the United States, plenty of fodder for Substack. And I just was curious. We noticed in our data this year that the nuns are about equally likely to identify as Democrats or as Republicans. We do ask these questions because we're the Bible Society. We don't publish them. We are not political scientists, but it just comes with the data. But something I noticed was that only about 10% of independents are nuns, and that's about half of what we'd expect if this were equally distributed. What do you make of that?
So the nuns are a really interesting voting block, because it's almost like I say that and I go, but the nuns don't mean anything on election day, because again, there's these sub segments of nuns. Atheists are 6% of America, about, depends on what survey you look at. They're very liberal, very left leaning, very democratic. Almost 90% of them voted for Joe Biden in 2020. So they're like the antidote to like white evangelicals on the one side. You got the atheists on the other side. Agnostics are not far behind, also 6%. About 82% of them voted for Joe Biden. So still a very, very blue group. But most nuns are not atheist or agnostic. They're nothing in particular, which is this big amorphous, lumpy, weird category in the middle of people. And by the way, they're about 20% of Americans are in this nothing in particular camp. If you put 5 nuns in a room, 1 atheist, 1 agnostic, 3 nothing in particular. So most nuns are nothing in particular. Politically, it's really hard to pin down that category, because they actually, Clinton only got 55% of their votes in 2016. So just blue, but just like barely blue. Now, Biden did better amongst that group in 2020, but I wonder if this current election cycle with Trump and everything going on with, the Democrats has made that group become a little bit more moderate over the last 4 years. And they might, now I'll say this, they might determine the outcome of the election, but here's a huge caveat with that. They are not politically engaged at nearly the rate that atheists and agnostics are. Okay. So 51% of atheists voted in the midterm elections in 2022. It was only 33% of nothing in particulars. So it's a big group, but you're getting a smaller slice of that bigger group. It's hard to turn them out on election day. So I really think when people ask, like, what's the key to the election? I go, it's this group that we can't define, the nothing in particulars. And they're everywhere, by the way. They're in every state. It's not just like they're not just in one state or one region or one part of the country. They're everywhere. So they matter a lot on election day. And yet you don't hear the parties talking about them. You don't hear anyone discussing like how to reach out to these groups. And I think they're really important from a sociological perspective and a theological perspective, because they are detached from American society. They don't engage in politics. They have low levels of education. They have very low incomes. They seem like they're dropping out of everything, every process in American life. And that should terrify us, right? As members of a democracy, but also as people of faith, because, we want people to be part of community, whether it be religious or non-religious. And it seems like there's a growing number of people who are just saying, no, I don't want any of that. None of the above. I check out. And I think we should be concerned with that, because that's how you get discontent. That's how you get problems. That's how you get all these people acting out, I think, is a lot of them feel like the world doesn't work for them. They feel like they're being overlooked. And so I really challenge people of faith they go, well, how do you find them? I go, good luck. You can't see what's not there. And a lot of them are just not there at stuff. So I think the church has to be really intentional about trying to say, I see you, you matter, and you belong, right? You belong in a faith community.
So you brought up a little bit about how some of the nuns are just checking out, not only of religion, but really checking out of society in a lot of ways. And at State of the Bible, we've been tracking several measures of well-being. You're very familiar with the Human Flourishing Survey and that work that's being done out of Harvard's Chan School of Public Health. And we have actually worked on some of that stuff separately, but as part of that same kind of scholarly group. But what we've noticed is that on most measures of human well-being, the nuns aren't doing that well. They score very low on happiness and life satisfaction. They tend to score very low on all the domains of human flourishing. They score low in hope. They score high in stress and high in loneliness. And they also don't engage very much in what normal people would call self-care. They don't take very good care of themselves. And so I wonder, what are the implications for those facts in America and for those of us who care about people with no religious affiliation who might be in our communities?
We try to stick close to the data, right? Like, as my job as a social scientist, I really like to say, well, the data says this. And sometimes you say that and it makes, the thing you say after that is going to make some people mad and it's going to make some people happy. And if you look at the overwhelming, sense that you get from looking at all these studies about mental health and religion, religious people tend to have better mental health than non-religious people. Like, it's just a thing that exists in the data. And we could talk all day long about methodology and measurement and all the things that political scientists love to talk about. But you can't ignore the fact that hundreds of studies have come to the same conclusion, which is that religious people tend to have better mental health than non-religious people. Now, there might be a selection effect there, right? Religious people, people select into religion who tend to have better mental health. So it's not religion doing it. It's just some other cause that leads to both good things. We don't know for sure, but here's what I do know for sure. Being in groups of people can be a very good thing for your mental health. The psychologists will tell us that solitary confinement is a form of torture. It's actually a violation of the Geneva Convention now to keep people in isolation for a long period of time, because it does psychologically rewire your brain. We are meant to be in community. That's a fact. And I tell people, I don't care what community it is, to be honest with you, whether it be, the Rotary or the Elks or the Moose or the Baptist church or the Catholic church or the synagogue. I really don't care, but you've got to be part of a group of people, ideally a group of people working for a common cause to make the world a better place, to improve your community, to improve your life. It sounds crazy to say this, but it shouldn't be controversial. Helping other people helps you. It does build up your own mental health. And I think it's hard for us to ignore all that data at this point. Now, some atheists are actually doing okay on these metrics. They have really good education. They have really good income. They're very politically engaged. And I say to them, hey, you know what? Fine, cool. You know what? You seem like you're doing okay. It's the nothing in particular group that I really, really worry about, because they're not doing well on any of those objective metrics. And again, remember, they're the group that's growing the fastest and is the largest part of the nuns. So when we think about the nuns, I don't think we should think about the atheists and agnostics, because they're in a different area of social life, political life, cultural life. These nothing in particulars, 1 in 5 Americans now. And amongst young people, the most popular response option among 18 to 22-year-olds is nothing in particular. 1/3 of them describe their religion as nothing in particular. It's more Protestants, only about 21%, Catholics about 18%. So this is a growing problem in American society. And I think we got to think bigger about this. Is not just a church problem. This is a society problem. And we've got to find ways to get these people back into community.
That's really fascinating. We've been looking again at our research, and one of the things we ask about is, are people curious to know more about Jesus, or are they curious to know more about the Bible? Right. And as you would expect, there's a group of people who are practicing Christians. They have lots of curiosity. There's a group that we call the movable middle, they're kind of Bible test drivers, if you will. 97% of them are curious about Jesus and or the Bible. That's the journey that they're on. When we look at the nones, we would expect to see something lower. And actually what we do see is about 36% of people who say they have no religious affiliation at all. They're curious to know more about Jesus and or the Bible, which kind of surprised me. And then a higher than expected proportion of them, it's 8%, indicated that their faith is important to them, which is, I think, maybe your category of ninos, right? Name only or something like that. Like I have no
Ninos, yeah,
particular faith.
yeah. Mm-hmm.
But what suggestions do you have about how we can help people who are curious about the Bible? Maybe they don't have a religious affiliation, how we can help them engage with Scripture and begin to interact with God's Word?
So there's been this really interesting movement over the last, I don't know, 6 weeks or so, where I saw Richard Dawkins now calls himself a cultural Christian. Elon Musk did an interview a couple of days ago where he says he's a cultural Christian now. I think there's definitely a sense of like the world has gone crazy and we're looking for solid ground. We're looking for some sort of like philosophical stability or theological stability. I think people went for a long time, like post-modernity's kind of run its course, and like everybody makes up their own truth, worked for a while until people go, yeah, but hold on. I need something solid to stand on. And I think people are looking for that. And I think people are hungry for that. And I think people are trying to make sense of, questions about gender and race and sexuality and IVF and, you name it, right? And they're looking for some reference to come back to. And I think that's where Christianity can play a really important role. And I think it's important to talk about a theological worldview. I don't think a lot of my students don't really see, for instance, they know the Catholic Church's position on abortion, but they also don't understand the Catholic Church's position on life, right? And I talk about the seamless garment and how they believe that life should be protected from conception to natural death, right? So that means that we care about abortion, but we also care about assisted suicide. We also care about capital punishment. It all comes back to this ethic. It's this schema to think about the world through this lens of life. I think people are dying to hear that sort of like macro level meta theology of like how to think about the world. And my students are so interesting because they go, okay, I don't agree with that, but I respect that. Like that is the level that Christianity needs to get to in America, I think, is just to say, like, listen, why do Christians believe X? Well, it emerges from this larger belief about humanity or society or my role or my posture towards life, right? That to me is a more effective way of like then proof texting and saying like, well, Luke 17:3 says this and John 4:7 says that. Talk about big narratives, right? Like what do we know about the Bible? What's it teach us about salvation and sinfulness and repentance and good works and the kingdom of God? And I think that doesn't turn people off because all you're trying to do is say, here, let me explain how I see the world, in a very like non-adversarial, controversial way, just saying like, this is my schema. This is my scaffolding. And it's helped me navigate these problems in life and get through these difficult situations. And it might help you too. I'm not saying you have to adopt it. I'm just saying here's an option, and let me roll it out to you in a way that makes sense to me and hopefully makes sense to you.
That's great. And it's so winsome to invite people to look inside Scripture and see if they don't find an open invitation to really a fuller life than they're experiencing without it. We're about out of time, but I do want to ask you one last question. You brought up earlier that people who are going to transition away from a household of faith to a life maybe of non-faith, they tend to make those decisions between the ages of 15 and 25. That's an era that some developmental psychologists call emerging adulthood. And I think for a lot of parents, maybe grandparents who have really had a life transforming impact from the Bible, they're connected to a community of faith. They're concerned about their children. They're concerned about their grandchildren. And they're wondering, what can people of faith do in raising their children to help them to be able to maintain that faith and appropriate that faith so that the faith of their fathers becomes their own living faith in adulthood?
Yeah, that is incredibly prescient because my church, I preached the very last sermon at my church on Sunday. And one thing I did was part of that was to thank the congregation for all the things they did for me and my family. And I'll just read you a part of that. It says, I can never forget how so many of you became surrogate grandparents to our boys, how you love them like your own, cheering for their milestones, buying them a toy for their birthdays every single year, showing up at their first communion and baseball games. I know this without a doubt. They will never, ever forget that. If that keeps them close to the church when they are adults, it will be in no small part because of simple gestures like that done with great love. You showed me what the church is and was and ever will be. And I think that to me is, if they stay close to faith, it's not because I'm a pastor and I preached a great evangelistic sermon. It's because when they were 7 years old, they walked in that church and felt surrounded by love. That feeling will stick with them for the rest of their lives. Their perception of church is going to be colored by that forever because of the kindness and compassion they saw from people of faith. I believe that we have to trust God is working in people's lives, even when we can't see it, and even if we don't know it. And that's what I pray for my kids. They'll find their way to faith because of how I live my life and what environment I put them in. It's not toxic. It's not adversarial. That's not controversial. It's not hateful. It's full of love and compassion and community. And I hope that carries them forward, right? I don't think you can, Philip Yancey once said, no one became a Christian because they lost the argument. And I think that's so incredibly relevant, with the next generation. Is apologetics is great. Don't get me wrong, but it doesn't work. I don't think long term. What works is showing people that you love them and you care about them. And I think, man, my kids grew up in an environment where they saw those things on display. People preach without saying a word. And I think that's what we have to think about with our kids and grandkids. Show them the love of Christ by how we treat them, how we talk about other people, how we orient ourselves towards service towards our community and our neighbors. That is way more valuable than any sort of proof texting lesson about, for all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God.
Seems like Jesus said something similar. They will know you are my disciples by your love one for another. And maybe that's a good word for us this year in particular in America and today as well. Thank you, Ryan. My guest today has been Ryan Burge. You can follow Dr. Burge on X at Ryan Burge, or you can subscribe to his excellent Substack, Graphs About Religion, at graphsaboutreligion.com. And you can learn more about the state of the Bible in America by visiting stateofthebible.org. And of course, you're always welcome to connect with the American Bible Society and join with us in the work we're doing in the United States and around the world. You can find us at americanbible.org. Thank you, and God bless you.